Welcome to the Living Springs Q&A podcast, where your questions are answered live every week by the pastors of Living Springs. Thanks for tuning in.
Oh, yeah. Finger guns.
Good day, everybody. Sorry, I just noticed Kyle's shooter guns. He had them ready before we even came on. So here
Someone's
we are.
excited to be back from holidays.
Good day and welcome to our Q&A podcast. We are back up live as far as we know and doing the way that it's typically done. The last couple of weeks have been a little bit of a mess, I guess, but we got them going. And today, Keelan says that things will be up on the YouTube channel anyways, and we'll be back.
I see myself in front of myself on YouTube. So
People are going to have a lot of podcasts to listen to.
That's right.
So they'll be able to scratch that podcast itch.
That's right. So maybe, like me, I listen to podcasts sometimes when I'm traveling on holidays. So maybe you're doing some summer holidays this week, and
we're just doing a
you can
nice
listen to some
content
podcasts.
drop for everybody to get caught up and have all that road trip listening.
That's right.
A content drop or a podcast dump?
Podcast dump has been already used, so I guess
Yes.
I don't get to change the terminology.
I believe that that's an official term. Like if you're in the podcast world,
Yeah. Well,
if you're
Keelan
like
is the
really-
media coordinator, and she said that, so that
she
must be the
said
official
this
language.
today
Bingo.
is a
Say it.
podcast dump.
Yeah.
That's true. It is not on us. This was all
a hot,
Keelan's
steamy
idea.
podcast dump. Keelan is reeling behind the cameras.
This is why I always like to be one of the people with a microphone.
Oh yeah, totally.
So when you don't have a microphone, you have really got no opportunity to say anything. So, but podcast dump, heading your way.
I'm thinking if somebody has stumbled across this for the first time today and they're like, hey, I'm
Who
going to
are
listen to
these
this
guys?
church podcast. We got shooter guns, we got dumps, we got, it's
Guns,
good.
the guns aren't foreign from some church cultures.
This is true. Send in your questions.
Not ours. But oh man,
Finger guns, maybe.
yes, that's true.
Well,
I feel like if people are just the people who just listen,
Yes.
I wonder if they're missing anything or if they're just like if they just imagine and it's so much better than if they actually watched it because they get to picture in their head what's happening while we're doing this. It's probably way better
Yeah, that's true.
than if they watched it.
yeah. So if you're watching, just turn it off and just listen. And just use your imagination. It'll be better.
They're picturing Kyle with like giant Nerf guns.
Yeah, totally.
I don't think anybody's ever said pew 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 with a Nerf gun. Well, maybe.
I'm pretty sure any child with any type of gun at some point has said pew pew pew.
Maybe.
Is that the gun reference, or are we back to dumping
Is there?
again?
Is this our first set of questions that we've already hit?
Well, you can tell it's been a while since the three of us have been.
Yes, because
Together.
we're giddy. We're giddy.
Too much
So.
fun. All right, well, I'm going to get to some real
Yeah,
questions.
let's
We got
not-
some AER.
We're not here for fun.
That's right.
We're here
This
because
is
we're serious.
This is church.
All right. So AER, accusations, explanations, and recantations. Go ahead.
Time
I'm
for
gonna jump in and-
accusations, explanations, and recantations.
Forgot we even had that. Even how the one
Wow,
made.
so-
I
Someone-
did,
you
I
take
did
a-
too,
You
and
take-
that's why I said it.
What is wrong with
and
you
then-
guys? You take 2 weeks off for holidays, and you're like, wait.
It wasn't just 2 weeks. There was a lot of weeks where we had it and it didn't work. So I'd given up on it. But we're working now.
Let's try this again. Hey everyone, let's officially start the podcast.
Time for accusations, explanations, and recantations.
All right.
Good enough.
For AER, I'm going to kick in first and do some that AER officially started when Doug came back from holidays and had lots to say on questions that we had done.
It wasn't when I had COVID.
Whatever it was, you were
I think-
away
I
and
think
you
it was
came
when I had
back and
COVID,
you
'cause I
had
was-
things you'd been stewing on to say about things we had answered while you were away. So I'm going to hit a couple of these.
I think that maybe that's a little more dramatic. I just had heresy I needed to correct. There's a difference.
Things he was stewing on. So I'm going to hit X just because I was mentioning it. It was more than 2 episodes back now, discussing pornography. Kyle stated the wife's body belongs to the husband body belongs to the wife. Is it saying essentially we shouldn't have autonomy over our own bodies once married? Just wanted to hit that's both of those parts need to be in play, or the whole equation doesn't work. If one partner is not willing to give their body over to the other partner, it's no longer, the equation doesn't work out. And so you have a consensual autonomy given to one another. And if one partner's not playing in that, if my wife says no to me with my body, then I don't get to do anything with my body. So the whole equation has to be there, or else it doesn't work. And therefore you can't demand of the other person something there. That's all I had to add. Sure, you guys can do that in a lot more great
we
detail.
addressed that question, and basically what we talked about was that verse gets used a lot in reference to sex, and that it's not just sex; it's everything. It's
Totally.
It's living the life of a servant that you are there for your spouse.
Yep. Bingo. And then I was going to comment on why as well, the one that on Image from Voxology. It's been a long time since I listened to that series, so I don't remember a ton that's specifically just from there, opposed to everything that I've kind of learned on imaging of God, but that we are just images of our Creator, and that's our role as humans in the world, both to one another and to the rest of creation, that we image His character, His goodness, and His pattern of how He was working in creation to continue that work here, so the whole cosmos can see God imaged in us. I'm sure you guys got into the story of coming up with
we talked about a lot about that, but that one, we both felt that you might want to say something because it referenced the Voxology podcast, which you were a big fan of.
Yep.
I've listened to some of the Voxology podcasts. I don't know if Blake has.
I don't think I've listened to any of that one. No.
But you are quite the avid Voxology podcast endorser.
Yes, and I just can't remember that series specifically because they talk about image in everything they do. Bible Project has a ton on image. I've done a lot of reading on image, so I just can't remember what was specific to that series.
So this is not a new series on Voxology.
It was a couple months ago. Now maybe 3 or 6 months.
Which it could have been when the question came in.
Yeah.
Right? If somebody's a little behind on the podcast, it could have been a month or so ago that we got the question.
Yeah. So just add that in, and then we've got one more. So host, I'll let you take it away.
All right, so this is the official AER question. It said, Doug said of the Israelites, you have 40 years, in brackets, a generation of people who live, have children, die, but weren't all the Levites and their families killed after the golden calf incident? This is taken from Exodus 32, 27 to 28. In fact, I was shocked by those two verses, having missed them in the past. I wonder how many people were left after the call.
Okay, so let me just read Exodus 32, 27 and 28. It says, and he, now this is speaking of Moses, he said to them, and he's talking to the sons of Levi. So I think that there's a bit of confusion in this question. We're going to try and clear it up, and then we'll get to the question. He said to them, Moses said to the sons of Levi, thus says the Lord God of Israel, put your sword on your side, each of you, and go to and fro from gate to gate throughout the camp. Each of you kill his brother and his companion and his neighbor. And the sons of Levi did according to the word of Moses. And that day about 3,000 men of the people fell. And so it was not the Levites who died, but a group of Levites, the sons of Levi, are the ones who are the Levites who actually went around doing the killing instead. And they culled or killed about 3,000 people on that day. And so how many people were left after the call? Lots. There were many, like hundreds, tens of thousands at least.
Time for accusations,
So you're looking at a nation
explanations,
that has
and
been
recantations.
raised up inside of Egypt.
Time for accusations,
Joseph
explanations, and
Jacob
recantations.
Jacob and his sons going to Egypt because Joseph delivers them during the famine at the end of the book of Genesis. And then Genesis ends with the Israelites staying in Egypt for a number of years where they prosper and they grow and they grow and they grow. And eventually a new Pharaoh comes in, and the new Pharaoh's like, man, we got a lot of Israelites here. We need to enslave them. And they continue to, then they spend, well, that starts before Moses. Then Moses is born. And then Moses, at some point as a young man, kills an Egyptian, and then goes into the wilderness for 40 years, and then comes back, and then the Israelites are delivered, and then you see this story.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more than 3,000 people.
And when the Israelites leave Egypt, it specifically mentions they brought other people who had been enslaved by the Egyptians with them as well. So now they've got a bigger group who have been brought into the Israelites. So now that multiplies those numbers as well.
But I'm just saying, in that time, I don't, off the top of my head, I can't remember the details of this, but I remember somebody doing some sort of, it was a talk about the provision of God and talk about manna, which would have been the Israelite people, and how God provided manna for the 40 years. Now, they were under the assumption there was hundreds of thousands of Israelites wandering around in the wilderness, and I can't remember where they got that number.
Yeah, there's it mentions how many legions that are in there at one point of Israelites, and if you do the math one way, it ends up nearly millions of people.
Yes.
But there's no archaeological evidence of that throughout the deserts there, so tens of thousands is a more likely number.
In any case, a lot more than 3,000.
Yeah.
It's not like there were 16 left.
Totally.
And we're not minimizing the killing of 3,000 people either.
No.
So
Just addressing the question that not everybody was dead.
it's not like when the Levites got done, there was Moses and 6 other people.
Yeah.
And they were like, all right, let's go take the promised land.
Yeah.
They had become a nation inside of Egypt that was enslaved, that was delivered.
Yeah. I'll also add on almost all, as far as I can think of, all the language of any kind of slaughtering taking place in the Old Testament typically is hyperbolic. Like they'll say, we slaughtered all of them, their women, their children, their animals, and then 2 chapters later, that same people group who they slaughtered them all is there, and they're prosperous, and they're back in their land. So there are a lot of these circumstances where this language is hyperbolic to make a point. The number 3,000 being a perfectly round number and being a 3 is important as well, and so there's symbolism within the number that's written down that I wouldn't make an argument either that even the 3,000 is literal, following the path of how all other slaughter language gets used in the Old Testament and knowing the numbers that round exactly.
But I also I would hesitate to try to minimize the number as well, right? Like, there might be some hyperbole, but at the very least, where you are on the hyperbole issue, there is going to be a rounding that takes place. It's not like they got to 3,000. They're like, okay, stop right there, so that'll be a good even number when we write this down later. You got to remember, this was written down later,
generations and generations
later, by an author who's rounding things off. Like when people talk about the number of people killed in the World Trade Center on September 11th, most people don't remember the exact number.
Totally.
So they say a number that is around that. Or the tsunami in 2004 that wiped out so many people in Asia. When they talk about, I think the highest number was 250,000 people. That's there. When you get into that number of people, you do tend to round off.
Totally. Just kind of looking at the language there and how it's used elsewhere in the Old Testament as well.
I guess I just look at that and go, people might be going, so then how do we trust it? There is hyperbole in Scripture, and that is one of the tools that is used. Not debating that, but just so people understand, that's that. And I would also say, like, this could be, because I just want to address the fact the person says, I was shocked by these 2 verses having missed them in the past. And it is one of those verses where you're like, yeesh. This makes me uncomfortable. Here's Moses, the man of God, who is like, hey, guys, strap a sword to your side and just walk through camp slaughtering people. This can seem really uncomfortable, right?
I'd like to recommend a book right now because I just finished last night reading Supernatural by Michael Heiser. And, different thinking after I read that book. Thank you, Kyle, for recommending that to me. And Doug, probably, I know you guys both read it. But, you guys should ask some supernatural questions, ask some Nephilim questions. I got lots of information in my brain right now.
There you go.
But yes, it is shocking always when we see seemingly God asking or Israelite people choosing to kill people in the Old Testament. It's always
what's
odd.
interesting, and I'm just quickly glancing Exodus 32. I didn't see this question until just before the podcast started. So just quickly glancing through it, so I may be missing something here. But if you look back, Exodus 32, this is the chapter of the golden calf. So Moses is up on the mountain, and he is communing with God while down below the people are creating a golden calf.
Yep.
And in verse 9, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, in order that I may make a great nation out of you." And then Moses intercedes, and we could get into a whole conversation there. And it does not appear that Moses... after Moses' intercession, in verse 14, it says, "And the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people." Then Moses goes down, and it's not saying Moses is acting on God's behalf here. In fact, it seems like Moses, while he's up on the mountain, is interceding for the people, and then he comes down, and then Moses sees it for himself, and then Moses gets angry.
Well, he does say in 27, "Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel."
But it does say Moses' anger burned hot in verse 19. So both those things are correct.
Yeah.
For sure, if you're just reading the text.
And this is where it kind of comes into play, the discussion of somebody speaking on behalf of Yahweh. Like we can get that wrong sometimes.
Yes.
Right? And so Moses is hearing what he heard on the mountain. God's angry. He comes down, his feelings get involved. And does he put those two conversations together, and then his own reaction of the 3,000? Is that something... Yeah, there's a whole
and I
conversation
think there's an interesting thing here. Now, again, I haven't read this in
We just
depth
looked
right
at it.
now. We're just looking at it. There's an interesting thing there about God saying, "I will do something," and then Moses doing something on God's behalf. Right? And ultimately, if God chooses to do something, he's God. But then when Moses goes down, like... you don't see anywhere in this chapter that God says, "Go down there, get the sons of Levi, tell them to put a sword on, and then walk through the camp slaughtering people." God does not seem to give that instruction. So Moses, it's almost like, gets offended on God's behalf and then starts acting in defense of God and in defense of God's honor, which makes me, like, and I look at that and I'm like, how many times have Christians done that? I'm going to defend God's honor when God doesn't necessarily ask us to do that.
Well, and when I've read this story in the past and just reading it here while you guys are talking, I'm always interested in timeline, right? And that's, when we look at any Old Testament, especially this stuff, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, those stories, when were they written? Who's handed down this information, and how literal are they, right? Because there's one point here, Moses comes down, he throws the tablets down, and they're broken, right? We would assume that's like instantaneous, right? Like he's walking down the mountain, he does this. But then he says he took the calf and he ground it into powder and scattered it on the water and made the people of Israel drink it. I'm like, that's going to take some time, right? And how do you get everyone to drink it? Like it seems like they'd have to be compliant. Like you can't make people drink something. And then the verses continue after. It says he sees the people are broke. Well, he has a conversation with Aaron, and Aaron tells him the calf just came out of the fire on its own, right? I always like Aaron's defense there. And then at verse...
one of those cases where it's like, you're a terrible liar.
Yeah.
You're a terrible liar. Don't lie. And I'm not advocating for lying. But if you're terrible at it, then don't do it.
And then we get, in the next verse, it says the people in the camp had broke loose. So at first it seems like they're compliant, like they are repentant or whatever. They drink this water with the ground powder in it. And now they're broke loose. They're just running chaos all over the camp. And then Moses says, all right, go and kill these guys. What's the timeline there? Like, is this like 20 minutes? Probably not. It could even be a couple of days. Who knows what's going on, right? So
it would have taken a while to grind that calf down because everybody brings all their gold to make this calf, and they left Egypt with a lot of gold, right? So this is not like a tiny little desk ornament calf that they built. We don't know how big it is, and he didn't have like a giant, trash compactor or something to grind it down in a few moments. There was no machine.
No forge workshop just right behind him.
Exactly.
And back to the fact you got, again, tens of thousands of people, right? Like it's not like 15 people in a small group figuring out what to do.
Yes. Having everybody come down to get a drink of this is going to take quite a while as well. So it's a fascinating story. So thank you to whoever submitted it. But I do think there is you see 3,000 people, good to get back to the question, you see 3,000 people killed this day. There would have been a lot more. That is ultimately the question. But it is fascinating and certainly raises a lot of interesting thoughts, just a quick glance through the chapter.
Totally.
And again, to answer the question exactly, all the Levites wouldn't have been killed. There still would have been, probably Levites' kids that were around. Like the genealogy.
But again,
be
it's the
passed
sons
down,
of
right?
Levi doing the killing.
Yeah, so the Levites are probably the ones least affected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because if you give me a sword and tell me to walk through the camp and kill people, I'm probably not going near my family.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and that's, I think, the question to me, and I remember how we answered the first question, is thinking through who would be left and what is the line or the lineage of the Israelite people and the Levites, who were supposed to be the priests or the ones who carried the law and were the ones leading. Yeah. That would have continued, even with 3,000 people dead.
Yep.
So,
All right. Should
Jump
we
into our
move
questions?
on to the real questions?
I guess so.
Well, I guess that was real, but in our list of questions. All right, so here's the question. It says, I am a proud member of the LGBTQ community, and I have a question for all of you. There are many questions on the podcast about LGBTQ rights, and I've listened to each of those episodes. However, I do wonder if you consider biology in the debate of choosing to be gay. If you don't believe in the biology of being born gay, I'd be curious to know when you all made the conscious decision to be straight, because it would seem that this would be the logical side of the argument. If someone chooses to be gay, then how can you argue you were born straight?
I want to say thank you to whoever submitted this question.
Yep.
And I want to say especially thank you if you don't come to our church and you just kind of stumbled into our podcast. That's awesome. Yep. We want this podcast to be for everyone.
Yep.
And we've said anyone who has any questions can submit them. So thank you for that. Now, I will say I have not gone back and listened to all of the things that we have said on this issue, because we've addressed this issue numerous times in various forms.
Over years.
Through the years of doing this podcast.
Yep.
We have talked many times. But I would say, I don't think that we have talked about being gay as a choice.
No.
I don't think that has been... And to the person who's asking, if you're aware of a podcast where we did, let us know the episode number, and we will go back and listen to it. Yep. But I don't think that that's something that we have a position we on this podcast have taken.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a position I haven't held in myself, so I don't feel like I could have spoken to it in that way. And there's lots more I'll say in a bit, but that's never a position I've even held and viewed it that way. At least not for a very, very, very long time, long before podcasts. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that. I'd say not obviously, but in my lifetime, I have definitely held that position, but yeah, I wouldn't say that I'm there.
Yeah, when that's what was inherited and given to us at a time.
Absolutely.
That's what I was told to believe at a time.
All of us growing up in church, right? And so for this person, and I don't know their context at all, but all of us grew up in different church contexts, but in the church.
Yeah.
And for me, old enough to have grown up at a time where it wasn't even talked about, it wasn't even a thing. Being 52 as a kid, this was just something that was never even addressed until I was in my adulthood.
Yeah.
Now you're 20 years younger than me, so maybe you were heard about homosexuality as far as a topic in church at an earlier age than I did. But certainly when it was first presented in the church, it was always presented as a choice, and this is the I'm using finger quotes for listeners, the Christian position on it was that it's always a choice.
Yeah. Yep, that's what has been largely held in the church since the mid-'70s, from what I was reading. I just read a book called Still Time to Care, and it did a history of church treatment of the LGBTQ community, starting, in the 60s is where it started, went into the 70s when you see your first conversion therapy type movements or ex-gay movements kick off, and that whole idea of sexual identity or attraction being a choice comes out of that movement, which is then widely accepted by church culture. Before then, that wasn't the case.
Yeah, and if that started in the 70s or 80s, it probably took a long time to get to my church in Kingsville.
Well, I think it's
Ontario.
the conversation, but I think that thinking, if anybody was going to talk about that from a church perspective, that was the primary position that was available.
Yeah, I'm just saying that in the 70s was my childhood.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like, I was born in 69, so 79 I was 10 years old. So in the 70s there, at some point in my childhood, you're saying this started. And I'm saying, okay, I recognize that. I was not aware of when this movement started.
Yeah.
But as far as, like everything else, things move slowly in different environments. And when you get into a small church in a small town in southern Ontario, it takes a while to get there.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Even though it was happening in regions and in places, in my childhood, it was not something that was ever talked about.
Yeah, and I only mention that because whenever churches got to that conversation, I think that was the widely held belief, as far as I see. Those ministries were the predominant response in a lot of evangelical contexts till the early 2000s is when those ministries start to shut down and struggle.
Well, and I think you guys have dug into this more than I have, so I feel like I'm the least educated on all this stuff. But I would say I get it. I understand why churches took that position early on, if you're saying 60s or 70s or whenever it was, because it's neater to be able to say God doesn't make any mistakes, because you probably, as a Christian, at some point believe that that is a mistake, that homosexuality is wrong, or whatever else you've been, again, taught. So then, obviously, God can't have anyone born that way. So that's what, in my understanding, led to the decision by most church people that it's a choice, right?
Totally.
Now, that is probably a very uneducated or a naive position compared to what we know in 2000, like you say, right?
So, and I think there could be a whole conversation around this, and we can take as much time as we want, I guess, but
and we probably will.
That whole way of thinking, I think, is a faulty view of understanding the human sinful condition, period. Right? Because I think if you apply that, and this is one of the earliest things that I started to think about in my own journey wrestling with this question, is if you can't be born gay, then you also have to argue why anybody is born with a disability. Like, did you choose that? Like, those things.
Okay, pause for just 1 second.
I don't want to clarify. Right?
Are you saying?
Yeah.
Are you equating the two? I'm asking.
I'm not equating the two.
Because that's what happens when people start using similar things. That people say you're saying that one is the other. So I'm just. I want people to be clear. Are you saying?
I was about to address it. Yeah.
Okay.
So and that could be from anything at all. I wouldn't necessarily call somebody struggling. Well, again, this is where language gets really tough. Somebody who their brain is wired has a propensity towards anxiety, so to speak, just a way their brain functions. That would be something that we are often born with. Any kind of condition that gives us a leaning towards something is a born condition. That then can be lived out in many different ways. There's lots of studies. Lisa Diamond did one. I know Preston Sprinkle has mentioned her, so I ended up picking up the Kindle book that she has. I think it's Sexual Fluidity Amongst Women is her book. It was a long time ago I read it. She followed like 10 or 12, maybe even more women over the course of 10 years who identified as non-straight to start, and each one of them changed their position multiple times, I don't think by making a choice, but she argues there's fluidity amongst situation, cultural influence, all these things where there are it mentions biology here. I think biology is one small part of it. I think chemistry is a huge one. I think we've got cultural influences, cultural awareness.
I'm going to throw another one in that I want to speak to when you're done.
Yeah.
Spiritual.
All of these things, these are a multiplicity of influences that would bring somebody to a place of how our identity, period, is lived out. And sexuality is one of those things that is influenced amongst all of these. And so I at no point have thought somebody chooses to be gay, though I would say there could be somebody with similar influences, one part that may lean into that part of their identity different than others. That's not saying they're making a choice like, do I want tacos or pizza for lunch? But simply that where I'm at, the experience I've had, the cultural influences, the cultural awareness, somebody who's in the exact same place in North America today with the same feelings, same biology, same chemistry, And somebody in Iraq, where there's punishment upon death, is probably not going to live out in the same way.
Yeah.
And so there's just so many influences there. I do not think it's a choice. I do not think it's a disability. Like, just to one more time clarify that. But I think there's a multiplicity of influences on our sexual identity, period.
So I want to begin by saying that we have on this podcast recognized that there are multiple positions that Christians have taken on this issue.
Yep.
There would be Christians who would be non-affirming, and there are Christians who are just as much Christians, Jesus-loving Christians, who are affirming.
Yep.
And we have recognized, so I'm not speaking for the church in general.
Yep.
I am speaking for Living Springs Christian Fellowship, because I feel like our position that we have taken in even recognizing different positions is a little outside of the norm of a lot of churches.
Yeah.
But I think it's the right position to take. And I think that a lot of people who've taken the position that you can't be affirming haven't done any research on it. And they haven't studied, they haven't looked at all into actually critical understanding and contextual understanding of what the Bible has to say to hear those who are affirming's argument, to wrestle with the validity of it. So there are a wide range of positions on that. But when I say what I'm saying, I am not speaking to this as a gay thing. I am speaking to this as a human thing. A key Christian belief is that we are all born sinners. And I'm not talking about gay people. We are all born with a sinful nature. No one who calls themselves a Christian should be reticent to acknowledge that. That is foundational of what we would say we believe. That every one of us has been born with this nature that is a part of us. It is not all of us. We are also people created in the image of God. And so I grew up in a church where all that was talked about was the sinful nature. And it was like all you were was a dirty, rotten sinner. And so there was no talk about the image of God that you were created in. There was no talk about original goodness, which continues to exist in all of us, and that we see, and that Jesus acknowledges when he says, anyone who wants to come into the kingdom has to come like a little child. That we see this level of this idea and this picture of purity and honesty in a child that we need to embrace. Authenticity, maybe, is the right word. In a child. That's not to say that children don't have a sinful nature. We all do, and we are all born with it. So I just want to say that in that I think anybody who calls themselves a Christian would be someone who should say, because maybe not all of them do, who should say, I recognize there are parts of my person that I was born with that God, in his grace and in his mercy, either has led me to, is leading me to, or will lead me to transformation over the course of my walk with God. And so I think wherever your position lands on homosexuality and on LGBTQ rights, and we could get into a whole other conversation on LGBTQ rights, but we'll put that aside for just a second so I can finish this thought. Whatever it is, we have to, like, if it bothers me so much that the church is full of people that the world thinks are self-righteous. We should be the people who say, I'm a screw up, and Jesus is helping me be less screwed up. That is the testimony of the New Testament, and that is the journey God calls us all onto. I have been a follower of Christ for most of my life, and for most of my life, it has been a journey of God showing me areas of my life that I was born in a certain way, that he's saying, okay, now we need to work on this. So I say all that to say, being born a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that that's God's desire. Wherever your position on homosexuality, and this is not a gay thing, we all are called to be people who follow the leading of the Spirit as he guides us into all truth, and who are being transformed by the renewing of our mind, not conformed to the pattern of the world. That we should all be walking in this place where we say, I'm a work in progress.
Yep.
I am a selfish person.
Yep.
All the time.
Yep.
And over the last few years, this is something God's been continually working on in my life, is just revealing to me how often the needle of my life points inward. And I just want to take care of and love Doug, and I want everybody else to do the same.
Yeah.
I could say I was born that way, and I would be right. And for a large part of my life, I was totally good with that. Yeah. This is something that God has been working in my life, going. So I say all that to say, I would agree with you that I don't believe you choose to be gay. I would say the same thing, that you are born gay, and I think that there's more than just biology there. Yeah. And I hear some of the things you're saying, but I also recognize, in addition to all of those things, the spiritual, and I think that's a bigger one than we realize. We live in this material world that's been so impacted by the Enlightenment that we don't think about or consider things that are immaterial. Yep. Even though we would say those are the most important things, right? Love. Yeah. We all want to be loved. Well, love is immaterial, right? Yeah. Thought is immaterial. Yeah. But these are important things. Yeah. So I would say people can be born gay, but I would also say people are born in all sorts of different ways. And I don't know that that's a justification. Yeah. I shouldn't say justification. I want to take that back. I recant, even before somebody sends in an AER. I guess I would like to say, if I was a person who said this is the way I was born, and then I never changed because that was the way I was born, none of you would want to be around me, because I was a terrible person.
Without examining what things you were born into. Is that kind of what you're saying? Without ever changing
and I'm not speaking about any person except myself. Yeah. I'm saying, growing up, I was an obstinate, stubborn, rebellious, selfish, outspoken, rude individual. Right. That's who I was. Yeah. For a long time. Right. Until I started allowing God space in my life to change things. Yep. I was someone, the day I left for Bible college, that my mom said, "You're not going to be a pastor, are you?" And I said, "No, not a way in the world." And she said, "That's good. You'd be a terrible one." That was my mother. And she was right. Yep. Because in that state, at that point, I was. Now, God did a lot of work in my life, and I'm not the same person. Yep. So I hope that if this person who submitted this question is listening to this podcast, that they're not hearing me discuss this solely as a gay issue. But I believe that the journey that God invites every one of us on, LGBTQ or straight or other, that God invites us all into this journey. And part of that journey is recognizing I'm a work in process, I'm a work in progress, and there are parts of my life that right now I'm totally good with, but that as I continue to follow Jesus, eventually he's going to want to address and change. Yeah. And I think that has to be everything. Yeah. All of our identities, not just the identities that people in the church aren't comfortable with, which would be, in a lot of churches, LGBTQ. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But there are people, so somebody could come in the church and be like, I identify as a lesbian or a gay person or a transgender person. Yeah. And the church would be really uncomfortable with that. But somebody else says, I identify as, we don't use the word, but I'm a workaholic. Yeah. And we're like, oh, well, that's not such a big deal. Totally. How is that not a big deal? Yeah. How is living with your life that out of balance not a big deal? Yeah. And if you're married and have kids, your family paying the price of that. And so we base these things on our comfort level, that we say that's what you need to work on, right? And And it's not based on allowing the Spirit of God to lead someone into transformation.
Yeah.
It's based on my comfort level.
Yeah.
And so if your sin, however I'm defining sin, is one that I'm not comfortable with, we need to change that right now.
Yeah.
But if your sin is one I'm okay with,
Yeah.
then I'm not going to say anything.
Yeah.
Right? Like, there's so much arrogance in the church.
Yeah.
And I'm not pointing my finger at any individual person, but there's just so much arrogance in the church.
Yeah.
And yet, what's the people group that God opposes?
Yeah.
The proud.
Yep.
But if somebody says, I'm really struggling with arrogance lately, we're like, wow, what a godly man.
Totally.
I'll stop ranting now.
Were you going to say
Yeah, I was just
something?
going to say, I think that's the whole thing to me, and it's bigger again than just, gay or LGBTQ, is as leaders in a church, or even as people who would consider themselves mature in the faith in any way, that have walked with Christ at some point, I would say, yeah, we always need to be pointing people to Christ and saying there's a transformative work, or transformative work, sorry.
We knew what you meant.
That is still happening and will happen your whole life. And there's a surrendered life that Christ calls us into.
Yep.
And I think on the flip side then, as someone else who is seeking Christ, whether that be the mature Christian or someone who doesn't know Christ yet, if God is God, and there's an acknowledgement of that, then the whole process is, how much will I surrender, right? Where do I hang on and go, I have the right to, or I want this, or I desire that, or I'm surrendered and laying down for Christ. And that's a journey, right?
And I just want to say, and I think that's the struggle that we're all called into, is that wrestling through of continual surrender.
Yeah.
In all areas.
To speak to that, I've had the privilege to read and listen to a bunch of people on both sides of this debate, on both sides of the affirming, non-affirming, who themselves would identify themselves as gay. Some who, there's the terminology that's been used, side A and side B Christians. Side A being affirming of, I don't feel a conviction against living with a gay partner, and so they're listening to the Spirit in that, and are not then going against the conviction they felt where they've wrestled with this theologically and listening to the Spirit. And I know of other people of the side B Christians who feel a conviction towards holding a historical Christian perspective in then submitting their sexuality in that journey of following Jesus, and so then stay abstinent as their choice to submit their sexuality to the way they feel the Spirit's leading them. And so there's people on both sides who I really have an admiration for.
Yes.
That's their journey with the Holy Spirit, not the demanded one with the stick over the head to get there. And I would see both of those groups of people as Christian brothers and sisters from where I sit.
And I think that the church needs to get back to helping every person in whatever context they're in wrestle through whatever God's wrestling in their life. And giving people that space to do it. Here's the truth. We're all so broken. We're going to spend the rest of our lives wrestling through to wholeness. And when we die, if we live to 120 and we're open to the work that God's wanting to do, that whole time, we'll probably only be 20% of the way healed. So there's still 80% of us that's broken. And
Speak for yourself, Doug. I'm going to be way higher than that. No, just kidding.
What did I say about pride?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry. God's still working on me.
That's the 5% left.
And I think that the church has really failed large number of people groups. Instead of saying all are welcome to come in and to journey with us and wrestle with God in whatever God wants to wrestle, whatever part of your life God wants to wrestle with you. And let God lead that process, not me. I can remember I was in Bible college. And that might be the first time that that I remember hearing this addressed. And it was a prof who was talking about in an early church context that there was a person in the early church, 2nd century or so, I just remember the general ideas, who was gay, identified as gay, and had decided to live not within that, And so the church, like, there's documentation of the church helping this person live this celibate life. And his point was, we need to help these people who want to live a celibate life and who are called to live a celibate life. And I think he would be non-affirming it. And I was like, yes, but I think the part that you're missing is that he arrived at that place of sensing the Spirit convict that in him on his own.
Yeah.
It was not that someone just told him, you can't do that.
Yeah.
But it was that the Holy Spirit was working in his life.
Yeah.
And so I think we've said numerous times on this how we see both sides. And I appreciate what you said. And I'm the same way. There are people who would be followers of Christ who would be completely affirming, and there would be people who would not be. And I look at the whole group and I go, we're all Christians, and we're all wrestling through this together.
Yep.
So I guess I just want to again say to whoever submitted this question, I hope you hear the heart behind our response.
Yep.
And I hope you understand that we are not simply speaking about this as a gay issue, but we're trying to just take a wider view than that one issue and say this all lumps in together. And I wouldn't call it gay. I would call it sexuality.
Yep.
I think that there are a lot of straight people who have not surrendered their sexuality to God, who are, constantly lusting, looking at porn regularly, doing all of the things that are wrong, and yet they feel okay with it because they're not gay.
95% of their sexuality is completely sinful, but because part of it gets expressed within a monogamous marriage, you're good.
Well, it doesn't get expressed within a monogamous marriage if they're lusting all the time.
And that's what I mean. Like, only 5% of it's expressed in a proper biblical way. The 95% of your sexuality is expressed in sinful ways, but you're good because you're straight.
Exactly, right?
Totally.
It's the fact that you're attracted to someone of the opposite gender, so it's not a big deal, or it's not as a big deal.
Yeah, totally.
Then the person, it is the struggle of all Christians to be on this journey of progressive surrender to God.
Yeah.
And as the church, we need to help people on that journey where God is working, instead of just telling people what to do.
Yeah.
We just made being a follower of Jesus a whole bunch of rules instead of inviting people onto the journey of allowing the Spirit guide them into all truth and letting God lead them in the process of working out their salvation.
Yeah.
Which is, it's funny that there's answers in the Bible, right? that people in the Bible actually struggle with these same things and wrote them down, and that's why God has, made this book for us, or however it wants to work out. But I think of the stumbling block passage in Romans 14 where Paul is talking, to a Roman audience, a Gentile audience, right? And he's giving them instructions on how to live and how to behave as inviting others to follow Christ. And he says, don't be a stumbling block. And the big issue is the one that he's using as example is the meat sacrificed to idols.
Yeah.
And that's a massive thing in that culture, right? Like there is so much involved there that we probably miss without understanding the history going on there. Yeah. But it's a big deal. And he's saying, look, stop, passing judgment on each other. Yeah. Stop causing people to sin and stop accusing them of sin, right? Yeah. He's presenting this real tension and saying, walk in it. And we do not do that. Like it's almost like this passage is not even written in the Bible. We're like, well, that one's too hard, so we just discount that one. Yeah. Or it doesn't line up with the way I feel best, right? Totally. I think,
Yeah. To take, I guess, a little bit of a turn and take it, I guess, off more of the pastoral shelf back into a little bit of the, seems a little bit more clinical discussion. Looking at some of the things I've read, thoughts that were popping back up in my mind of the idea of choice. I don't think it's a binary of either just 100% choice or 100% born. Like I remember looking up twin studies at one point, identical twins who are every way biologically and down to their DNA identical. One choosing to be gay, or one being gay and one not being
involved in a gay lifestyle.
Yeah,
we'll say that.
One who is gay and one who is straight. And so though their genetics are identical, living out differently, So it's neither a born nor a choosing. It's this multiplicity of influences, as I said, and there's
Nature versus nurture.
Exactly. There's all of these things coming into play. The rise currently at Gen Z, as far if I can remember correctly, the average population of non-straight people in previous to Gen Z was like 1% to 2% at the highest rates. Gen Z is like 8 or 9% for non-straight. So is there all of a sudden something changing? Like,
Can I ask what age is Gen Z?
Gen Z would be 94 or 90. No, sorry, 96.
94-year-olds?
No, 1996 and up.
1996 and up. So they would be up to 26 years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's the age. So the rate at which they're identifying as non-straight is much higher than any other culture. So is all of a sudden there being more people born, or is there, again, this multiplicity of influences that are allowing people... there's just a broad conversation about sexuality that's happening that it's not a binary of born or not born. There's all these influences to look at.
And I just wonder...
Yeah.
Does that number stay at 8 or 9% in another 20 years?
Right.
Or they're young adults wrestling through things.
Yeah.
And I don't have the same position on a lot of areas in life that I did when I was 20.
Yep, totally.
Right? And so does that, and I don't know the answer to that, but I recognize that the cultural, the world we live in now, you're going to ask questions about your sexuality that quite frankly, I never did.
Yeah.
And I recognize that probably in my high school, there were people who were gay who hid that because if they came out, they would have been mocked mercilessly.
Safety in the culture is absolutely a helpful thing for people to be able to come out.
There
Like,
were no gay people in my high school in the sense of anybody who was openly gay.
Yes.
And so there were gay people, but they hid it because they would have been social outcasts.
Yep.
Absolutely. So there's a difference there.
Yeah.
But I do look at that and go, is that number higher?
Yeah.
Because they're wrestling through it and maybe they just haven't come to an answer yet.
And then so I just throw all that out to say it's neither just born or not or choice. I think there's all these influences. So by us saying we don't think you're born that way does not necessitate then, or us agreeing you're likely born that way does not mean it's a choice or just born. I wanted to address there's just so much nuance in this conversation as there are so many others.
Yeah, I like that.
We've got a few minutes left.
You want to jump to CC? Would that be a faster one to
No,
address?
I actually wasn't done with this question.
Oh, okay.
Because should we get in a little bit of trouble?
Well, we've got 8 minutes. How much trouble can you resolve in 8 minutes?
Well, I want to just speak to, because whoever submitted this question just mentions LGBTQ rights. And I want to just, and maybe we're going to open a can of worms that we're not going to be able to close in the few minutes we have left.
Yeah.
But it is in the question, so I want to just take a minute to talk about that. And a couple of weeks ago when you were away, Blake and I started a question and then didn't finish it and left it till the next week. Now, we haven't posted those podcasts yet, so nobody knows that. But we did that, so we may do that again here. When it gets to LGBTQ rights, the wider church's position has always been, for the last 50 years, they should not have any.
Right.
And I'm going to be honest to say I struggle with that.
Oh, yeah.
Immensely. And it seems like a wrong thing to me to say, if two people are in a monogamous relationship, whether I condone that or not, and then one of them reaches the end of their life and needs care, and the other person can't go see them because it's not recognized, I'm sorry if this offends someone who's a Christian. I think that's wrong.
Yep.
I think that if you have a couple that are same sex who've been married and then one person dies and the other person can't access a pension because they are a same sex couple, that's wrong.
Yep.
Whether I agree with that or not, what you're doing is saying, because you don't fit into my box, you should live outside of the the rights and privileges that someone who does fit into that box.
Yeah.
And I think this lends into a whole thing which will never get done in the few minutes we have left on Christian nationalism.
That's what I was going to say.
And the role of the church and the role of trying to legislate morality.
Yeah.
And that is not the church's job
Yep.
to legislate morality or to say to someone, because you're X, you are denied this thing that the rest of us get. And so I have, and maybe this upsets somebody in the church, but I have a real problem with the church's position that it's taken on LGBTQ rights, especially, well, not especially, in all cases, but because the majority of these people wouldn't call themselves Christians.
Yeah, exactly. That's the issue.
That's totally
the Western
and whether
world,
they do or not is irrelevant.
Yep. The Western world founded on libertarian values or liberal values, not liberal as in left-leaning politically, liberal,
And not libertarian,
Yeah. No,
which
sorry, yeah.
means
Le-
like
sorry, yeah,
the
yeah.
absence of
That's-
all government.
yeah. Liberal as in the sense of human
Freedom.
rights and human freedoms,
Yes.
which the Western world is founded upon, means every human should have that available to them by the government and all of that. The minute you take church or Christian or religious language and try to throw it into state legislation, using that for national laws of any kind, you have conflated two things. And I've heard it put this way, and it is so accurate. Anytime church and state get in bed together, church loses. And I don't think
No, I think state loses too.
yes, but
Because, no,
church
you-
gets muddied so much and gets ruined. So if we want to look at policies and politics that the Western world is founded on, they need to, their LGBTQ rights are human rights versus the conversation of what that looks like as a lived out Christian is an entirely separate context. And the minute we try to conflate those
Okay,
two,
but
it's an
let's
issue.
take a step back from church.
Yeah.
Anytime religion and state get in bed together, everyone loses.
Totally.
Because you end up, it's not just in a Christian context.
yeah.
Because we want.
I mean, in church as religion, not just Christian church, any.
But
yeah.
but you can't say that because in countries where there's Sharia law,
yes,
you see that affects everyone.
totally.
And so it's not just the church that loses; it's everyone who loses.
Yeah, the phrase just church and state is typically a euphemism for religion and state.
I understand, but my point is, it's not the church that loses.
Yeah.
When the church and the Roman Empire got in bed together, it was not just the church that lost. It was the people they burned at the stake.
Yes.
It was the people in Israel they got killed in crusades.
Yep.
It was all of these people
Yep.
whose lives were affected negatively
Yep.
by the people who were called to be the salt and light of the world.
Yes, totally. Yeah.
So I think we covered that in the few moments that we had. Now maybe we'll get some AER on that, and if you have pushback or thought on that, we'd welcome that. We would love to continue this conversation. If you disagree with us, if you agree with us, if you have a question about that position, feel free to send that in, and we will start here next week. But I just felt like there was something to be said there.
Yeah.
Because it's a nuanced thing, and I do think it speaks to, and maybe you wanted to ask about Christian nationalism. If somebody sends an AER on Christian nationalism, we've got all of next week done, because Kyle and I will rant on that for at least an hour, and Blake won't be able to get a word in edgewise.
Cool. Well, let's wrap up then, because now
We'll
they're
let
letting
you
me
talk
speak.
now.
Right on. We will see you guys all again next week. Look forward to learning lots and listening to lots of podcasts this week as you catch up. So we will talk to you later.
Enjoy.
This has been the Living Springs Q&A podcast. If you have a question you would like answered or would like to learn more, visit us at livingspringsairdrie.com. Thanks for tuning in.